Hey, what it is, guys? It's T.rex here, and I am happy to bring to you the third installment of the interview series with Dr. Thomas Carr. And before you proceed, please make sure you're up to date with the part 1 and part 2. And also, don't forget to check out this super duper mega awesome Tyrannosaurus resin kit. And once you're caught up, come back here and we'll carry on. In the meantime, enjoy the video. Next section is the Tyrannosaur-ontogeny, and what can you tell us about the current project you are working on and the specimen Jane?
Yes, so I'm working on a monographic description of a growth series of T.rex, and the central specimen is Jane, this relatively complete, almost complete subadult T.rex. It's only about 20 feet long. Histologically, it's about 11 years old. And like other subadult tyrannosaurs, it's very sleek and lightly built. The skull is long and low. It hasn't deepened yet, which is sort of the classic appearance of the big subadults and adult T-Rexes. And so this project is a description of every single bone, and it compares Jane to less mature T-Rex and also to adults. So I try to capture at least the three major parts of the growth series, and this makes for a very big description. It will be published as a book. It will probably be the least interesting book anyone's ever read. Just reams of comparative osteological description of T-Rex, but if that sounds cool to you, then great. Then
Will it have pictures?
It will be complete. Jane will be completely illustrated, so every bone will be appears in a photographic plate in multiple views. I'm preparing comparative plates comparing every bone of Jane to less mature animals and to adults, so people can see the major changes during growth. I'll also be including images of a 3D print of the reconstructed skull, which has a lot of information in and of itself. So there will be a series of color photographic plates illustrating each skull bone at least, and also this 3D print. So it will, right now the manuscript is over 1,000 pages. That's double spaced. So, but in the end, it's going to be, a book that's probably, might approach, 800 to 1,000 pages. It's going to be a big one, and it will probably be the most complete description of a dinosaur ever published. But keep in mind that it's a description of the growth series, which is necessary to capture the variation of this species. It didn't make any sense to me to just describe Jane, to just describe one skeleton that has no context.
Sure.
And so the book describes T-Rex in a comparative context of growth. And so there's a lot of bits and pieces of juvenile T-Rexes out there, including the Cleveland skull, that get full treatment in the monograph. So there will be quite a bit of attention paid to the Cleveland skull. It will get a full, thorough comparative description itself, and it will be fully illustrated as well, photographically. So it's Jane plus loads more.
Awesome. I'm really looking forward to this, and as long as it got pictures, that's what matters, isn't it? So.
Yes. Yeah, there's several hundred figures.
Several hundred figures, couple thousand diagrams, and times that by a million letters. No big deal.
Yeah, we're looking at a very big book.
But I'm pretty sure this will be important, though, for as far as the history of scientific publication and literature goes, because this will give us a nice idea and a place to maybe at least the most up-to-date place to go to if you wanted to examine the details of their growth patterns.
Yeah, my modest hope for it is that it does serve as a template for other workers in terms of how to approach descriptions of species, how to make a comparative, how to take a thorough comparative approach. We'll see what effect it has. Could be that people will hate it, but part of the reason why I've taken this book length approach is that it's always disappointing for me to see how short descriptive articles are of either new dinosaur species or old species. Articles seldom, are seldom over 30 pages. Description's very lean. The level of comparison is quite limited. And I just, given the quality of preservation of Jane, its completeness, taking that approach just didn't seem justifiable. There seemed to be a greater opportunity at hand. But we'll see. We'll see how people respond to that.
Well, you know the saying, haters gonna hate. So, while we're still at the ontogeny section, why are the words so difficult? Section is an easy word to remember. While we're on an ontogeny section, do you know, or do you have any suspicions, whether or not the specimen Sue has actually been a fully grown individual, or was it still growing prior to its death?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm happy to answer that, even though it's based on unpublished material. Just to give a bit of background, in 2004, Tom Williamson and I published the first cladistic growth series for a dinosaur, for T.rex, and I've since expanded that data set to include specimens like Sue and many others. And when I first saw Sue's skull, back when I was doing my PhD, it was really cool. They actually rolled Sue's skull out of its bulletproof case for me. And as they did so, I immediately recognized that Sue was when it died, it was a very young animal. And that may sound surprising given its size. But Sue has a very youthful face. It has very rough nasals. That's the most obvious feature of the fact that it's not a full adult animal. When T.rex gets fully mature, the nasals smooth out. And so Sue had a very rough face, and I thought, wow, this is a very young animal. This isn't what I expected. And when I have run versions of the updated analysis, Sue falls out as a young adult. So it falls out in this group that includes the famous T.rex specimen in New York, AMNH 5027. So those are relatively young, rough-snouted young adults. And then the big adults smooth out their snouts. So, for example, the LA skull, the LACM 23844, so the classic Los Angeles adult specimen.
Is it not nicknamed Thomas as well?
Yeah, there's a subadult there named Thomas.
Oh, it's a subadult name, yeah. Right.
But the adult was found by Harley Garbani many years ago, long before Thomas was found. But Sue's a relatively young animal and still has a lot of changes to go through. Or when it died, it still had, a full life ahead of it.
So this is very interesting because if the analysis of it being 27 or 28, like prior 28. To its 28, was it?
Yeah.
28 years old. Does that mean that they're basically not even half of their life cycle yet? Perhaps maybe they could have lived much longer?
That I don't know. All that can be said is 28 years is the oldest age for a T.rex we have right now. My prediction is that if we count the growth rings in more mature animals like the LA adult, they'll be older chronologically than 28 years old. That's the prediction. But so far, the big adults haven't been sampled yet. So we'll see.
Of course.
But in my view, 28 years old isn't the maximum age. It just doesn't seem possible.
This is very interesting because, and I like to say interesting a lot in this interview, I noticed that this is going to almost become like a parasite word here. It's, well, you see that being 28 years old and still being young kind of gives an idea that there is quite a long way to go still, potentially. Potentially, yeah. So, okay, well, that's one more point about the ontogeny is how, well, first of all, how often, do we actually know how often they replaced their teeth, and how do the estimates vary for, particularly tyrannosaurids, or just theropods in general, the tooth replacement?
Yeah, for T-Rex, the tooth replacement rate is variable, but basically the replacement is about a year. And that's based on work by Greg Erickson. So I think the replacement rate decreases as the animals get older, but it's on average it's about a year. One of the more controversial hypotheses that I published is that the tooth count of T-Rex decreases as the animal matures. So we have more teeth in juveniles and subadults than there are in adults. And the work that Tom Williamson and I did in 2004 does show that. So the most mature T-Rex in our analysis has fewer teeth than, say, the New York skull, which fell out in the analysis as a young adult. And so we see this trend throughout growth, even among the adults, of decreasing tooth count.
Are you ready for this?
Yes.
The validity of the Nanotyrannus lanchensis, or however you pronounce the damn thing. Please, thank you very much.
So Nanotyrannus lancensis.
Yes, thank you.
Is
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. It's what's called a nomen dubium. It's a synonym of T-Rex, and Tom and I actually officially sunk Nanotyrannus in our 2004 paper. So we synonymized it with T-Rex. And the type specimen is in Cleveland. I actually went to see it in May for to include in the Jane monograph. There's just a few gaps. So I know that specimen quite well. So in my view, Nanotyrannus is a false positive. It was thought to be an adult pygmy tyrannosaur, but it turns out that all the features that make it different from T-Rex are growth-related. They're juvenile features that are also seen in all other tyrannosaurids. And the skull also shares features with adult T-Rex that are not seen in other tyrannosaurs, such as the wide forehead and the narrow snout and the forward-facing eyes. Those are T-Rex features. So the weight of evidence shows that the Cleveland skull is really a juvenile T-Rex. And it was also claimed that it had many sutures in the skull, closed and fused, analogous to mammals and birds that tend to close up their sutures. But on close inspection, those sutures are not bridged by bone. They cannot be said to be fused at all. And actually, fusion between skull bones and tyrannosaurs doesn't happen during growth except in the brain case from the young adults forward. So none of the sutures that should be closed are closed anyway. These are brain case sutures. So the weight of evidence shows that the Cleveland skull is a juvenile T-Rex, and there's no reason to carry the fiction forward of Nanotyrannus.
Right, so well, that's sorted, I guess, and let me
Not
see.
in everyone's mind.
Oh, what is that?
It's not sorted in everyone's mind.
Yeah, I know, but we'll just say it's sorted. Although it's gonna be very difficult for some perhaps to accept that, but we'll see. Maybe this will only call for further, more detailed studies on other sides who support the validity. Maybe they will test it further and they will come to the same conclusions as you have, and we'll just have to wait and see, because
Yes.
Hypothesis is there. Go ahead and test it. So it's out there for the grabbing.
Yep.
Am I making sense?
Yes, I agree.
Because I find that a lot of times I say things and they obviously dumb things down too much, because I'm just that kind of guy who does that on my channel.
I'd say you're making things clear, not dumbing them down at all.
Well, thank you. Awesome to hear that. Now, let me see if we may have actually left anything out. Oh yes, one more question: whether or not the juveniles or younger adults, who obviously differ in a body plan from the fully grown mature adults, do they occupy different niches in their ecosystems? And is there any data that we can use to test that potential idea, validity of that idea?
That's a really good question. I think we can approach it through analogy on the one hand and more rigorous analysis on the other. So by analogy, we see big changes during the growth of other predatory sauropsids and archosaurs. So, baby Komodo dragons look very different from adults. They're much more sleek. Same thing for crocodilians. They change a great deal when they grow up. And along with the increase in size and the shape changes that they go through, their prey change as well. So baby Komodo dragons and crocodilians eat things like insects. Then they graduate onto, say, lizards and amphibians and fish. And as they get bigger and their shape changes, their prey gets bigger correspondingly, and the species change too. So I think we should expect to see the same general type of trends in tyrannosaurs and basically all meat-eating dinosaurs. For that matter, all extinct archosaurs would go through the same thing, all the predatory ones. In terms of identifying niche partitioning, I think that's a slightly different emphasis. And that's where, what's implied there is some fundamental difference in the biomechanics of the animals, like say in terms of the construction of their skulls, the width of their teeth. And I think that's where modeling, virtual modeling, say finite element analysis, that sort of thing would be most informative to see if the forces being transmitted through the skulls are fundamentally different between young animals and the adults. So I think niche partitioning requires a bit more rigor, but I think at the very least we can say that the juveniles were not eating and killing the same things as the adults. It's just based on what we see in the living world, that just doesn't really happen.
Sure. So, okay, makes sense. I mean, obviously, like on one hand, we want to see any, fossil evidence for this, but on the other, we kind of have enough room to compare between what we can find their closest relatives and just generally, even looking at ourselves, we change our diet as we grow up. So
yes,
it's reasonable then to assume that they would change their diet as well, and that would dictate what ecological niche they would occupy.
Yes. Yeah, it's very hard to imagine an adult T-rex eating dragonflies.
Yeah, I would probably say it might be accidentally possible.
But it's easy to imagine that a hatchling would. That's only a meter long.
Speaking of which, a slight tangent here, but just a quick yes or no. Do we have any evidence of any interesting dragonfly specimens preserved in the same period as T-rexes?
Oh boy, I don't know.
Okay, we'll have to find out.
Yes.
So let's now slowly transition into the next part of this discussion, which is drums, Tyrannosaurus. The one and only Tyrannosaurus Rex, that is, I mean. So what is your view on the functionality of the T-Rex forelimbs? A very popular question asked around.
Yeah, I think the best way to approach that question is to consider the function in the basal tyrannosauroids. They have relatively long arms, three-fingered hands. They would have been very helpful in prey capture and manipulating food, possibly doing other things like just, getting off the ground, that sort of thing. But so I think for the classic tyrannosaurids, the short-armed, two-fingered form, that we see in things like animals like T.rex and Albertosaurus libratus and so on, I think it's safe to assume that the forearms were used for everything its closest relatives used them for, that is the relatives with the long three-fingered arms, except for capturing prey. Because the head of the advanced tyrannosaurids was almost certainly the main way they captured prey, not with their arms. But the arms still did everything else except capturing prey. But what that everything else is, we can only speculate because no one has ever seen a tyrannosaurid do anything but lie on a tabletop, right? So there's, I think it's a good question, but it's important to keep in mind the limits on what we can know. We can certainly model a forelimb. We can model the muscles, get the range of motion, which, by the way, is very limited in the advanced Tyrannosaurus. The humerus didn't have much of an excursion, at least based on the bones. The elbow joint was fairly limited in its excursion as well. There's not much flexibility in the wrist or in the fingers. Doesn't mean it was useless or not powerful. They certainly were powerful arms. They certainly could grasp. But in terms of the actual function, we just have no information. But we have to assume that they were used for whatever they were used for, except hunting.
Sure.
And I don't think that the biomechanics necessarily will tell us what the arms were used for. What we will, what the biomechanics and kinematics does show is the power and the power of the forelimbs and the range of motion. And that's the limit on our knowledge. And so we have to be honest with ourselves about that.
So yes, of course, it's okay to basically not know exactly what some of these things may have or may not have been possible, but like you pointed out as well, how there's a clear difference of the body plan and how it changed over the time. Like we have in the earlier period groups, we have the three-fingered larger forearms, but smaller heads as well. While on the other hand, we have later period body plan, which is a lot more mass concentrated in one area, in particular the head and the neck and the torso. In T-rex, I think it's actually even higher emphasized than even in other tyrannosaurines. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah. T-rex it's in a space of its own. It's truly an exceptional animal. I think a lot of that has to do with size, but in addition, I do think that the head is truly different in terms of the expansion of the chamber. It is doing things a little bit different, not fundamentally, but perhaps more efficiently. And I should add that it's very easy to imagine an extinct animal doing something in some particular way. What we have to do is take a step back and ask ourselves, what evidence do we really have for that function, whatever it might be, say, slashing with its arms, right? That's, that abstract that was presented or published recently. And I haven't seen that talk. I've just read the abstract. It's easy to imagine a function. But the question is there really evidence for it? And we have to be honest with ourselves about the limits of the information we have regarding the function of, say, the Tyrannosaur arm or, say, horns in Triceratops. We can imagine just about anything, but is it really true?
True. I mean, not to say that it is true, but I'm saying true, that you are right. It's an interesting play of words here.
Yes.
So, more about the awesome Tyrannosaurus, because Tyrannosaurus is awesome, and since there is no denying that Tyrannosaurus is awesome, why don't we get into the subject of potentially larger specimens than Cu? For example, there have been obviously fragmental isolated parts which are pretty much impossible to restore, given that they are not providing us with information, but there's a specimen in Canada called nicknamed Scotty. So have you had experience looking closer at this specimen, and what can you share about this specimen?
Yeah, I've spent, I think, a week or two with Scotty a number of years ago. It's big. The skull length is around 1.4 meters. In general, it's one of the larger rexes in terms of skull length. That's a little bit longer than the measurements there is for Sioux. It's not that mature. It's a young adult. That's based on one of my more recent growth series. So it's the interesting thing about Rex is that its size tops out at a femur length of about 1.2 to 1.3 meters. And so you'll see, among the big adults, the skull lengths, be anywhere between 1.4 and 1.2 meters. So there's some variation there, and it's not much. But it does seem that the size does max out. And so I haven't seen yet a femur length greater than 1.3 meters. Maybe Rex did get bigger than that, but right now the evidence doesn't show it. So there does seem to be a ceiling on their size. I know that there's a pretty big maxilla and dentary in the collections of Berkeley, and I actually haven't seen those specimens. It's partial skull. But even then, I mean, I've seen casts of the maxilla, and it's not tremendously larger than other large adults. It's probably closer in size to something like Scotty, but not exceptionally greater. So Rex does seem to have a ceiling to its maximum size, and I think we do see that in other dinosaurs, that they do not, that the adult size is fairly limited. Yes, so I don't think, we'll be seeing T-Rexes, with a 6-foot long skull. I just don't think that's possible. It could be, but right now the evidence shows, a maximum skull length of about 4.5 feet, and they just don't seem to get above that. They don't really need to, since they're the largest predator in the ecosystem. We already know that they're the largest tyrannosaurid to have evolved. And so this maximum size does seem to be limited. And that's something we should expect to see anyway.
Yeah, of course. I mean, technically speaking, it does its job. It does what it needs to do, and it doesn't seem to be causing them problems, or else they would have probably went extinct before the grand extinction.
Yep, and in addition to that, we've been collecting T-Rex specimens for over 100 years, and we haven't found, say, a Rex with a 6-foot-long skull or a femur that's longer than 1.3 meters. That just hasn't happened. So it's starting to look like the data are starting to level out and constrain our expectations for what there is to find.
Good stuff, good stuff. So that means that you will obviously be looking at this other skull specimen, the MOR008, once you go there in January?
Yep, it's on the list of things to do. I have to complete scoring it for the growth analysis. So, and I'll get a skull length for it too.
It's a good looking skull as well. It's absolutely, may I just say this openly, badass?
Yeah, it's an impressive animal. I have seen it through the glass. It's fairly complete, well preserved. So yeah, I look forward to sort of getting my paws on it.
Now, of course, I wanted to mention this brief point in this section of the interview that a lot of my friends, specifically the author of this diagram that we have been looking at earlier on during the session on the Tyrannosaur integument, he personally wanted to send his regards and thanks for putting your effort in. And he wanted me to ask you as well whether, I mean, we did cover already whether or not there's a chance of more evidence to be added to this collective diagram eventually to update it, because like you said before, everything is out there. We just need to dig and find fossils. But regarding to the references that are made to your work and paper, are you happy with how they are presented in the diagram?
Well, I think overall it's accurate. I think if the red is the areas where we have the information, he could extend that over the lacrimal and jugal too. But otherwise, I think it's accurate.
Very nice. The reason why I'm asking as well is because we want to know whether or not this... I mean, obviously it's not an official scientific publication, not yet. Hopefully he will eventually get this published in a literature. I'm rooting for him. But in terms of, at least for general kind of knowledge and educational purposes, just, you know, for the sake of using it on my channel, for my viewers, do you reckon it is good enough to demonstrate the point?
Yeah, I think it does demonstrate the point. Basically, he could just, in terms of our image, he could just follow that. So he could color the rest of the postorbital and jugal in red and the lacrimal as well. And then that would, you know, match what we've published. So he's got the dentary covered, the maxilla and nasals, and part of the postorbital. So there's just a couple gaps to fill there. And what is filled is accurate.
Nice. That's really nice to hear as well, because earlier on, what a coincidence again, one of our friends from the Paleo World group, which you are a member of as well, lucky for us, Go Paleo World group, and the specimen, if you look at the Tarbosaurus thoracic region, the big sort of chunk, so to speak, right there in the middle above the arm, this has been, the correctness, the validity or correctness word has been confirmed by Dr. Philip Curry, who's just done the interview as well. So the reason why I was very pleasant, you know, I don't know, my reaction to this and positive responses, because we're getting confirmation that we are doing our research properly, which is nice to know.
Yes, indeed.
Awesome, awesome. I am absolutely like emitting a lot of positive energy to my viewers right now. So
that's good.